A Gathering of Crows and Death. A Hercule Poirot Mystery, Part I. The Gathering. First thing Hercule Poirot noticed about Mont Saint-Michel was not its magnificence, nor the solemn grandeur of its ancient abbey rising like a vision from the sea. It was the crows. They gathered in unusual numbers, black against the pale Norman sky, perched upon stone gargoyles, battlements, and the jutting ribs of the medieval walls. They watched. They waited. And to Poirot's fastidious mind, they observed. "Mon ami," Poirot murmured to Captain Hastings beside him, adjusting his immaculate mustache. "When nature assembles in such number, it is never without reason." Hastings laughed lightly, pulling his coat tighter against the salty wind. "Surely you don't suspect the birds of plotting murder now?" Poirot did not smile. "I suspect nothing," he replied softly. "I observe everything." The tide was retreating, revealing the causeway that connected the island commune to the mainland. The stones glistened whitely, like scales of some ancient sea creature. Above them loomed the abbey, serene, eternal, and utterly indifferent to human affairs. Yet human affairs, Poirot knew, had a way of staining even the most sacred stone. The invitation Poirot had not intended to visit Mont Saint-Michel. His visit to France was meant to be restful, a short holiday, to soothe his nerves after a particularly exhausting case in Brussels. But the letter had arrived 3 weeks earlier, written in a precise, elegant hand. "Monsieur Hercule Poirot, I request your presence at Mont Saint-Michel as a guest, not as a detective. There are matters here which trouble me deeply, though no crime has yet occurred. I fear, however, that it soon will." Armand Valette was a name Poirot knew well. A wealthy antiquarian and collector of medieval artifacts, Valette had made and unmade several reputations in the academic world. He was admired, envied, and quietly resented. Poirot never ignored fear, written with such restraint. The house on the rock, Valette's residence, was not within the abbey itself, but nestled lower on the island, a restored medieval manor overlooking the sea. Its windows were narrow, its walls thick, and its corridors designed more for defense than comfort. The guests had already begun to arrive. Valette greeted Poirot warmly, though his smile never reached his eyes. "My dear Poirot," he said, clasping both of Poirot's hands. "You came. I hoped you would." "I always come," Poirot replied gently, "when I am invited by unease." Valette's laugh was brittle. "Then you will find plenty of it here." The gathering that evening. The guests assembled in the great dining hall, beneath beams blackened by centuries of smoke. Poirot observed them carefully. Isabelle Moreau, Valette's private secretary, efficient, intelligent, and guarded. Her eyes flicked constantly toward her employer, as though measuring his moods. Dr. Lucien Bernard, a historian specializing in medieval religious orders. Earnest, absent-minded, and clearly uncomfortable among wealth. Madame Celeste Fournier, a celebrated spiritualist. Draped in black silk, she spoke often of energies and portents, and eyed Poirot with knowing curiosity. Etienne Roche, Valette's estranged nephew. Handsome, bitter, and visibly resentful. He drank too much and spoke too little. Father Michel, a monk from the abbey. Quiet, observant, and possessed of eyes that seemed to see far more than he said. And lastly, Marguerite Violet, Armand's second wife, elegant, distant, and younger than her husband by nearly 20 years. A curious collection, Poirot thought. Not friends, not family. A selection. Dinner and ominous words. The meal was exquisite, yet conversation was strained. At one point, Madame Fournier leaned forward, her voice dropping theatrically. "This place," she said, "is a convergence. The tides, the stone, the past, it all remembers." Roche snorted. "Rubbish. Mock if you like," she replied serenely. "But even the crows know." At that moment, a loud caw echoed outside, startling several guests. Valette's hand trembled slightly as he lifted his glass. "You see?" Madame Fournier continued. "A gathering of crows has meaning. Death follows." Poirot watched Violet closely. Fear, yes, but also something else. Guilt? Anticipation? Or knowledge? The private warning later that night. Valette requested a word with Poirot in his study. The room was lined with manuscripts, reliquaries, and artifacts, objects steeped in history and secrecy. "I have enemies," Valette said abruptly. "People who believe I have stolen from them. Ruined them. Have you?" Poirot asked calmly. Valette hesitated. "I have. Acquired things others wanted." Poirot nodded. "And you fear one of them will kill you?" "Yes, or worse." Valette lowered his voice. "I fear someone already plans to." "Then why gather them all here?" Poirot asked. Valette's eyes flicked toward the window, where crows clustered on the ledge. "Because," he said quietly, "the truth must surface. And Mont Saint-Michel does not let secrets drown quietly." The night before death, as Poirot retired to his room, the wind rose sharply. The tide surged back toward the island, cutting it off from the mainland. Poirot stood at the window, watching the black shapes of crows wheel against the moonlight. "All enclosed," he murmured. "All isolated. And all with motive." Below, in the courtyard, a single figure moved swiftly through the shadows. Poirot noted it carefully, and somewhere in the ancient stone of Mont Saint-Michel, death prepared its entrance. Part 2. The first death morning at Mont Saint-Michel arrived not with sunlight, but with mist. It crept in from the sea like a living thing, coiling around the stone foundations of the island, swallowing the causeway, softening the sharp lines of the abbey until it appeared to float detached from the world, suspended between heaven and water. Hercule Poirot awoke early, as was his habit. He disliked disorder, and the fog offended him. It concealed too much. He dressed with meticulous care and descended the narrow staircase toward the breakfast room. Halfway down, he heard voices low, urgent, and unmistakably distressed. Poirot paused. Then he continued. The sound came again, a sharp intake of breath, followed by a cry that echoed horribly against the stone walls. "Mon Dieu!" Poirot quickened his pace. In the small courtyard at the rear of the manor, several figures had gathered. A maid stood frozen near the well, her hands pressed to her mouth. Isabelle Moreau knelt on the ground, pale and shaking. Father Michel stood rigid, his lips moving silently in prayer, and at the center of it all lay Armand Valette. He was sprawled awkwardly at the base of the ancient stone steps leading down toward the tidal flats. His body lay twisted, one arm bent beneath him at an unnatural angle. His head rested against the stone, eyes open, staring sightlessly upward. Above him, perched on the parapet, sat 3 crows. They did not move. Poirot approached slowly, carefully. He did not look first at the body. He looked at the surroundings, the angle of the steps, the dampness of the stone, the marks near the edge. Then he looked at Valett. Captain Hastings arrived moments later, his face draining of color. "Good Lord," he whispered. "He's dead, isn't he?" Poirot nodded. "Yes, mon ami. Quite dead. An accident?" The local gendarme, Inspector Leclerc, arrived within the hour, ferried across by a small boat before the tide fully reclaimed the island. He was a solid man with a practical manner and an expression already inclined toward simplicity. "A fall," he said after a brief examination. "The steps are old, slippery with the mist. A tragic accident." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Tragic, yes," he agreed mildly. "But accident? That remains to be seen." Leclerc frowned. "There is no sign of a struggle." Poirot gestured delicately with his cane. "There is also no sign that Monsieur Valette intended to descend those steps at dawn." Isabelle Moreau looked up sharply. "He never did," she said. "He hated the cold mornings. He always took breakfast in his study." Poirot smiled faintly. "You see, Inspecteur, already the little gray cells awaken." Leclerc sighed. "Monsieur Poirot, with respect, a man falls. He breaks his neck. It happens." "Yes," Poirot replied softly. "And sometimes a man is helped." Statements. The guests were gathered in the dining hall, pale and shaken. Breakfast sat untouched on the table. Poirot listened up. Madame Fournier dabbed her eyes theatrically. "I warned him," she said. "I felt the disturbance last night. Death was close." Etienne Roche laughed harshly. You always feel death close. Convenient, isn't it? She turned her gaze on him. Mockery does not protect the guilty. Roche's jaw tightened. Marguerite Valette sat perfectly still, her hands folded. Her face was composed to composed. He was restless, she said quietly. He left our room before dawn. Said he needed air. Poirot inclined his head. Did he say where he was going? No. Poirot noted the hesitation. Dr. Bernard adjusted his spectacles nervously. I heard footsteps, he said. Early. I assumed it was Father Michel going to prayer. Father Michel shook his head. I did not leave my cell until after the bell. Poirot smiled politely. Then someone else was awake. The steps. Poirot returned to the scene alone. The stone steps descended toward a narrow path, leading to the tidal flats, a path treacherous at the best of times. The mist had left the stone slick, but Poirot noticed something else, a faint scuff mark near the top step. Not the mark of a slip, but of a sudden stop. He knelt, ignoring the dampness, and examined the edge carefully. Interesting, he murmured. A fall, yes, but not an uncontrolled one. The object, later that afternoon, Isabelle Moreau came to Poirot quietly. There is something, she said, her voice low. Something I found in Monsieur Valette's study. She handed him a small velvet pouch. Inside lay a medieval signet ring. Heavy gold, engraved with a crow in flight. Poirot's eyes sharpened. This ring, Isabelle continued, was not among the catalogued items. He kept it hidden. Poirot closed the pouch gently. And did Monsieur Valette tell you why? She hesitated. He said it was dangerous. Poirot nodded slowly. Dangerous objects, he said, are often dangerous because of what they represent. By evening, the tide had risen fully, cutting the island off once more. The sense of isolation deepened. Poirot stood at the window, watching the water swirl around the base of Mont Saint-Michel. One death, he murmured. But not the end. Behind him, Hastings shifted uneasily. You think there will be another? Poirot did not answer immediately. Instead, he picked up the signet ring and turned it in the light. A gathering of crows, he said softly. And death follows. Outside, the crows took flight, circling once, twice before settling again on the ancient stone. And somewhere within the manor, someone watched Poirot very carefully. Part 3. Secrets in Stone. Mont Saint-Michel had endured 1,000 years of prayers, sieges, confessions, and betrayals. Stone remembered what men forgot. Hercule Poirot believed this with absolute conviction. That morning, as the abbey bells tolled low and solemn for Armand Valette's death, Poirot stood alone in the cloister, his gloved hand resting lightly against the cold wall. The stone was damp with age, its surface worn smooth by centuries of passing hands. Stone, Poirot murmured, is the most discreet of witnesses. It sees everything and says nothing unless one knows how to listen. Behind him, Father Michel approached silently. You wish to see me, Monsieur Poirot? Poirot turned, smiling gently. Yes, Father. You are a man of this place. You understand its hidden ways. The monk inclined his head. Mont Saint-Michel has many passages not marked on any map. Just so, said Poirot. And I believe Monsieur Valette knew them well. Father Michel's eyes flickered, only for a moment, but Poirot saw it. The hidden door. The abbey library lay high above the village, accessible by a narrow spiral staircase that seemed deliberately designed to discourage the unfit. Poirot ascended slowly, methodically, refusing Hastings' offer of assistance. Order, Poirot panted mildly, is worth the effort. The library was vast and shadowed, its shelves heavy with manuscripts bound in cracked leather. Dust motes floated lazily in the filtered light. Dr. Lucien Bernard was already there, poring over a parchment. Ah, Monsieur Poirot, he exclaimed. Extraordinary place, isn't it? Some of these texts predate the Crusades. And some, Poirot said softly, predate honesty. Bernard blinked. I beg your pardon? Poirot did not answer. Instead, he walked slowly along the far wall, his eyes scanning not the books, but the stone behind them. Then he stopped, a faint irregularity a line where there should not be one. Poirot pressed gently. The wall shifted. Hastings gasped. A secret door. Father Michel crossed himself. It leads to the old scriptorium. Sealed for decades. Poirot smiled thinly. Sealed, Father? Or merely forgotten? The scriptorium, the hidden chamber, smelled of dust and ink long dried. A single narrow window admitted a blade of gray light. On a stone table lay several objects. Rolled parchments, a leather-bound journal, and most striking of all, a wooden box carved with the image of a crow. Poirot approached it reverently. Inside lay documents, letters, contracts, and one brittle confession written in a trembling hand. Poirot read silently. Then he closed his eyes. So, he said at last, the past has claws. Bernard leaned forward eagerly. What is it? What did they say? Poirot looked at him sharply. They say, Monsieur Bernard, that history is rarely as noble as historians prefer. The old crime, the documents told a story buried for nearly 30 years. A medieval artifact, the Crow reliquary, believed lost during the Revolution, had resurfaced decades earlier. Its discovery should have brought fame. Instead, it brought ruin. 3 men had claimed it. One was Armand Valette. Another was Professor Henry Laval, Bernard's former mentor. The third name made Poirot pause. Etienne Roche's father. The reliquary vanished. Laval was disgraced, accused of forgery. Roche's father died bankrupt. Valette prospered. Poirot closed the journal gently. And now, he murmured, the crows gather again. Confrontations. Poirot wasted no time. He summoned Dr. Bernard first. You admired Professor Laval, Poirot said mildly. Bernard's hands trembled. He was destroyed. He took his own life. And you believe Valette responsible? Bernard's silence was answer enough. Next, Etienne Roche. My uncle was a thief, Roche spat. He stole my family's future. Yet you came here, Poirot observed. Not to kill him, but to confront him. Roche's eyes burned. I wanted him to confess. Poirot nodded. Confession is a powerful motive, but not always a murderous one. Madame Celeste Fournier, received Poirot draped in black velvet. Candles flickering dramatically. You knew about the reliquary, Poirot said. She smiled serenely. I knew the energy around Valette was corrupt. Poirot leaned closer. You knew more than energies, madame. You knew secrets. Her smile faded. I was Laval's lover, she whispered. Valette ruined him. Poirot straightened. And yet you did not push him down the steps. No, she said softly. I wanted him to live with guilt. Marguerite Valette last of all. Poirot spoke with the widow. You married him after the scandal, Poirot said gently. You knew who he was. Marguerite's eyes were cold. I knew what he had done, and you stayed. For security, she replied simply. Poirot studied her. Security, he repeated. Or leverage. She said nothing. The stone speaks. That night, Poirot returned alone to the steps where Valette had died. The tide was low. The stone dry. He placed his foot carefully where Valette must have stood. Then he smiled sadly. No struggle, he murmured. Because there was no surprise. Someone Valette trusted, someone who knew the steps. Someone who knew the past and wanted it buried forever. Above him. The crows stirred. Poirot looked up. Patience, he told him softly. Soon, the stone had spoken, and it had named more than one sinner. Part 4. The second victim, Mont Saint-Michel, no longer felt like a monument to faith, that it felt like a trap. The tide had risen again during the night, sealing the island from the mainland with a certainty that was almost malicious. The sea surrounded the rock on all sides, gray and restless, as though impatient for what would come next. Hercule Poirot stood at his window, hands clasped behind his back, and considered the uncomfortable truth forming in his mind. One murder may be passion. 2 are design. An uneasy morning breakfast was a subdued affair. The guests gathered reluctantly, each acutely aware of the others, as though invisible lines had been drawn between them overnight. Captain Hastings leaned toward Poirot and whispered, Everyone looks as though they expect to be arrested or killed. Poirot nodded. That, mon ami, is because one of them should be. Madame Fournier sat apart, her usual theatrical confidence subdued. Dr. Bernard barely touched his coffee, his hand shaking so badly that Isabelle Moreau quietly removed the cup from him. Etienne Roche stared fixedly at the window, jaw clenched, while Marguerite Villette maintained her composure with chilling precision. Father Michel entered last. "There will be a requiem mass this afternoon," he said quietly. "For Monsieur Villette." Poirot inclined his head, a fitting gesture. Mont Saint-Michel appreciates ceremony. Father Michel met his gaze. "And truth." Poirot smiled faintly. "Yes, that also." The Abbey at noon. The Abbey church was vast and echoing, its stone pillars rising like frozen prayers. The chant of the monks filled the space, low and rhythmic, reverberating through bone and thought alike. Poirot sat near the back, his attention divided not between heaven and earth, but between the living. He watched Dr. Bernard knelt rigidly, his lips moving too fast, his eyes darting nervously. Madame Fournier wept softly, though Poirot noted that her tears began and ended with remarkable control. Roche stood with arms folded, refusing to kneel. Marguerite Villette sat straight-backed, her face pale but dry-eyed, and Father Michel. Father Michel watched them. The mass ended. The bell tolled, and death answered. The second cry, it was Hastings who heard it first. A sharp, terrified scream cut short. Poirot was already on his feet. The sound came from the North Tower, an area rarely used, its narrow staircases leading to old storage rooms once occupied by monks centuries earlier. They ran down the stairs, twisted upward, steep and claustrophobic. Halfway up, Poirot noticed something that made his heart sink. A door stood ajar at the top. They found Dr. Lucien Bernard. He lay crumpled at the foot of the tower window, his body broken against the stone floor. Blood pooled darkly beneath his head. One arm was flung outward, fingers curled as though clutching at something no longer there. The window above him stood open. Outside, the wind howled, and a crow perched calmly on the sill. Inspector Leclerc arrived moments later, breathless and grim. "Another fall," he said heavily. Poirot turned on him sharply. "Do not insult the dead with laziness, Inspector." Patterns emerged. This fall was different. Poirot examined the scene carefully, ignoring Leclerc's impatience. "No scuff marks," Poirot murmured. "No sign of slipping." He crouched beside Bernard's body and gently opened the dead man's clenched hand. Inside was a scrap of parchment. Old, brittle, marked with the faint outline of a crow. Poirot closed Bernard's fingers again. "Two men," he said softly. "Both connected to the same past. Both falling from stone heights, and both conveniently explained away as accidents." Leclerc's face darkened. "You were saying—" "I am saying," Poirot interrupted, "that Mont Saint-Michel is being used as a weapon. Fear takes hold. Panic spread quickly." Roche confronted Poirot openly. "You brought this here," he accused. "Your questions. Your digging." Poirot regarded him calmly. "Truth does not kill, Monsieur Roche. People do." Madame Fournier refused to leave her room, claiming disturbances in the air. Isabelle Moreau hovered nervously near Poirot, clearly frightened but resolute. Marguerite Villette remained eerily composed. "You are not afraid?" Poirot asked her quietly. She met his gaze. "Fear is useless." Poirot studied her. "Perhaps," he said, "but indifference can be lethal." The lock passed that evening. Poirot returned to the hidden scriptorium. Thought he reread the documents, this time with Bernard's death fresh in his mind. Bernard had not only believed Villette guilty, he had been preparing to prove it. Tucked between the parchments, Poirot found something new, a note written in Bernard's hand. The reliquary was never lost. It was hidden, and the one who hid it still walks these stones. Poirot closed his eyes. "Ah," he murmured. "So that is why he died today, and not 30 years ago." The crowbox Isabelle Moreau joined him quietly. "There is something else," she said. "Something Monsieur Villette kept locked." She produced a small iron key. Together, they opened the carved wooden box found earlier. Inside lay not an artifact, but a map. An old abbey map, marked with symbols only someone intimately familiar with Mont Saint-Michel would understand. Hidden passages, vertical shafts, and one mark circled twice in red dot the north tower. Poirot exhaled slowly. "The killer," he said, "knows this place better than history books ever could." A private realization that night, Poirot did not sleep. He sat in his room, the map spread before him, the signet ring beside it. Two victims, both men who could expose the truth. Both pushed, not struck, not poisoned, but guided toward death. "This is not rage," Poirot murmured. "It is control." Outside, the crows gathered again, their silhouettes multiplying against the moonlit stone. Poirot looked at them thoughtfully. "Yes," he said softly, "I see you now." The killer was not avenging the past. The killer was protecting it. And unless Poirot acted quickly, Mont Saint-Michel would claim a third soul. Part 5. Lies beneath the tide, the sea withdrew from Mont Saint-Michel with deceptive gentleness. At dawn, the water slid away from the rock as though ashamed of what it had witnessed, revealing the vast tidal flats, rippling sand, dark channels, and treacherous pools that reflected the sky like broken mirrors. The island stood exposed, ancient and unblinking, its stone foundations streaked with salt and memory. Hercule Poirot watched the retreating tide with an intensity that bordered on reverence. "Now," he murmured, "the sea tells the truth." A window of hours. The tide granted a narrow window, 4 hours at most, before it would return with merciless speed. Poirot had planned for this moment. He had slept little, his mind arranging facts into neat, inevitable patterns. Captain Hastings joined him at the parapet, peering down at the flats. "I don't like the look of that sand," he said. "It's like walking on a sponge," Poirot nodded. "Exactly. And yet someone did walk there, recently." Below them, Inspector Leclerc supervised a small search party, their boots sinking with each step. The gendarme looked unconvinced, irritated by the morning chill and by Poirot's insistence. "You think there is evidence out there?" Leclerc called up. Poirot lifted his cane and pointed not randomly, but precisely toward a darker channel, curving away from the base of the island. "There," he said. "Follow the line where the sand is disturbed but not washed clean." Leclerc hesitated, then gestured to his men. They went. Footprints and falsehoods. The footprints were faint, but they were there, compressed sand forming. A deliberate path that led away from the stone steps where Armand Valette had fallen. Not the chaotic marks of a stumble. Not the erratic impressions of panic. Measured steps. Poirot crouched carefully, examining them. "One person," he said. "Not heavy, not rushed. And returning." Hastings frowned. "Returning?" Poirot tapped the sand lightly with his cane. "You see, mon ami, the depth is different. The outward steps are lighter, the return steps slightly deeper." The person lingered, perhaps to be certain. Leclerc scowled. Certainty of what? Poirot straightened. Of death. The tides. Give further along the channel, half buried in wet sand, something glinted. A metal clasp. Poirot's eyes sharpened. It was a cloak fastener, old and ornate, shaped unmistakably like a crow's wing. Madame Fournier wore such fasteners. Leclerc picked it up triumphantly. "There. Proof." Poirot raised a hand gently. "Non, Inspector. Temptation." Leclerc bristled. "It belongs to her." "Yes," Poirot agreed. "Which is precisely why it is too convenient." He turned the clasp over. "The sand here has been disturbed twice. Once when it fell. Once when it was placed." Leclerc stared. "Placed?" Poirot met his gaze. "The killer wishes to accuse another." Alibis under pressure. Poirot gathered the remaining guests in the dining hall once more. The atmosphere was brittle, charged with fear and resentment. "We will speak of the night of the first death," Poirot said calmly, "and of the morning of the second." He began with Madame Fournier. "You say you were in your room meditating?" "Yes," she replied smoothly, "until dawn." Poirot nodded. "And yet, your cloak was missing its fastener." Her eyes flickered. "I lost it days ago." "Indeed," Poirot said. "And someone else found it." "Next, Etienne Roche. You were drinking late." Roche sneered. "Hardly a crime." "No," Poirot agreed. "But you left the hall shortly before Valette did." Roche stiffened. I went to my room. Did you? Poirot asked mildly. Or did you go to the courtyard? Roach said nothing. Poirot turned to Marguerite Villette. You say your husband left your room alone? Yes. At what time? She hesitated. Around 5. Poirot smiled faintly. You see, madame, the tide charts say otherwise. The tide chart. Poirot produced a folded document. At 5, he said. The tide was already retreating. Anyone going toward the steps would know the flats were exposed. Marguerite's composure cracked, just slightly. You are suggesting. I am suggesting. Poirot interrupted gently, that your husband did not go for air. He went for a meeting. Isabelle Moreau gasped softly. A meeting, Poirot continued, with someone who knew the tide. The third place. Poirot led them outside, down toward the exposed flats. He stopped where the sand darkened abruptly. Here, he said. A third place. Hastings looked puzzled. Nothing's here. Poirot smiled. Exactly. He knelt and brushed away sand with his gloved hand. Stone emerged. A hidden foundation, part of an old wall long swallowed by the sea. And here, Poirot said, pointing. Someone stood and waited. Not to push, but to persuade. Persuasion. Poirot's voice softened. Villette was not attacked. He was confronted. With proof. With threats. With the past. He looked at each face in turn. Bernard was killed because he knew where the reliquary was hidden. Villette was killed because he knew who hid it. Leclerc swallowed. And the killer? Poirot closed his eyes briefly. Someone who moves easily through hidden passages. Someone who knows the tides. Someone who believes Mont Saint-Michel must protect its secrets. Amongst silence, Father Michel stood apart, hands folded. Poirot approached him slowly. You have lived here all your life. Yes. You know every stone. Yes. And you were mentor to Bernard. Father Michel's eyes lowered. I taught him history. And he taught you doubt, Poirot said quietly. The monk said nothing. The crows cried overhead. The sea returns. A distant roar announced the tide's return. Water surged back toward the island, erasing footprints, swallowing evidence, reclaiming silence. Poirot watched it calmly. Lies, he said softly. I like these sands. They appear solid until the sea comes back. He turned. One more death, he said. Perhaps 2. The killer is not finished. And Mont Saint-Michel, once again surrounded by water, waited. Part 6. The false solution. Hercule Poirot announced his solution at precisely 4 o'clock in the afternoon. He chose the time carefully. The tide was high, the island once again sealed from the mainland, and the weather had turned sharply cold. The sky hung low and metallic above Mont Saint-Michel, pressing down upon the ancient stones as though demanding a confession. Poirot stood in the great dining hall, his posture immaculate, his expression calm to the point of serenity. The guests assembled, reluctantly. Fear had changed them. Fear always did. The announcement. Madame met messieurs, Poirot began, his voice measured and courteous. I have reached a conclusion. A collective intake of breath followed. Inspector Leclerc straightened. Hastings leaned forward. Isabelle Moreau clasped her hands tightly together. Poirot allowed the silence to stretch, just long enough. The deaths of Monsieur Armand Villette and Dr. Lucien Bernard, he continued, were not accidents. They were murders. Carefully planned, symbolically executed, and rooted in the same past crime. No one disputed this now. Poirot turned slowly toward Madame Celeste Fournier. And the murderer, he said gently, is Madame Fournier. The room erupted. The reaction. What nonsense. Etienne Roche shouted. Madame Fournier herself staggered back, one hand flying to her chest. You accuse me? After all my suffering? Leclerc moved instinctively toward her. Monsieur Poirot, are you certain? Poirot nodded gravely. Entirely. He gestured with his cane. Madame Fournier had motive. The destruction of Professor Lavelle, the man she loved. She had opportunity, free movement, no fixed schedule. And she left behind a deliberate clue, the crow-shaped clasp. Madame Fournier's breathing grew rapid. That clasp was stolen. Just so, Poirot replied. Stolen or sacrificed. He folded his hands. She wished the truth to be seen. She wished to punish. and she wished to be caught. The room buzzed with confusion. Hastings stared at Poirot in disbelief. The performance, Madame Fournier laughed suddenly. A brittle, high sound. "Very well," she said. "If that is your truth, Monsieur Poirot, then arrest me." She spread her arms dramatically. "I warned him. I foretold death. I confronted him. And yes, I hated him." Poirot watched her carefully. Too carefully. Leclerc hesitated. "Madame, could you kill them?" She met his gaze. "No." Poirot smiled faintly. "Ah," he murmured. "You see, Inspector?" "She denies it." Leclerc frowned. "Many murderers deny, but not this one." Poirot interrupted softly. The cracks appeared. Poirot began to walk slowly around the room. "Madame Fournier is theatrical," he said. "She enjoys spectacle. If she were the killer, the deaths would be dramatic, ritualistic, unmistakable." He stopped behind Roach. But these murders were quiet, controlled, efficient. Roach stiffened. Poirot continued. Madame Fournier did not know the hidden passages. She did not know the tie charts by heart. She did not know where Bernard would go after Mass. Madame Fournier's shoulders sagged. "I am a liar," she whispered. "But I'm not a killer." Poirot inclined his head. "Precisely. The real purpose." Leclerc rounded on Poirot. "Then why accuse her?" Poirot's eyes flicked, not to Fournier, but to Father Michel. "To observe," Poirot said calmly. "Reactions." Father Michel stood perfectly still. Too still. A dangerous silence. Poirot turned fully toward the monk. "You did not react," he said gently. "Not when Madame Fournier was accused. Not when she denied it." Father Michel's voice was steady. "I am a man of faith." "Yes," Poirot agreed. "And of Mont Saint-Michel." The monk's eyes darkened slightly. Poirot pressed on. "You know the tides. You know the passages. You knew Bernard's research and feared what it would reveal." Father Michel folded his hands tighter. "I serve God," he said, "and stone." Poirot replied softly. The interrupted death. A sudden crash echoed from the upper floors. A scream. Isabelle Moreau. Poirot spun around. Now. They ran. The third attempt, they found Isabelle at the entrance to the hidden passage near the scriptorium. She was pale, shaking, one hand clutching the wall. "He tried to lock me in," she gasped. "Said I knew too much." Leclerc drew his pistol. Footsteps echoed. A head retreating. Poirot did not chase. He smiled sadly. The mask slips back in the dining hall. Poirot spoke quietly. The false solution served its purpose. The killer panicked. He looked directly at Father Michel. "You have killed twice," Poirot said softly. "And you nearly killed a third." The monk's face was rigid, but a flicker of something relief perhaps passed through his eyes. "You misunderstand," Father Michel said. "I protected this place." Poirot nodded. "Yes, and that is why you are the most dangerous man here." A warning. Leclerc moved closer to the monk. Poirot raised a hand. "Not yet," he said. "The truth is not finished speaking." Outside, thunder rolled faintly over the sea. Poirot felt it in his bones. "One more act remains," he said quietly. "And Mont Saint-Michel will demand its price." Part 7. The past returns. The storm broke just after midnight. Rain lashed Mont Saint-Michel with sudden fury, drumming against stone and slate as though the sky itself demanded absolution. Lightning split the darkness, illuminating the abbey for a heartbeat at a time, its towers stark, severe, and pitiless. Hercule Poirot sat awake in his room, fully dressed, his mind alert. The past never stays buried, he reflected. It waits. A confession deferred. Father Michel had not been arrested. Not yet. Inspector Leclerc had argued loudly, impatiently, but Poirot had insisted. Arrest without understanding, Poirot had said calmly, is merely noise. I require clarity. Now, clarity approached. A soft knock came at the door. Poirot rose and opened it. Father Michel stood there, rainwater darkening the hem of his habit. His face pale but resolute. "You wish to speak further," the monk said. Poirot stepped aside. "Enter, Father." The monk's story. Father Michel stood rigidly, hands clasped. You believe I am a murderer, he said quietly. Poirot regarded him with sympathy. I believe you are not. The monk flinched. I was young when the reliquary was found, Father Michel began. Too young to understand ambition. Too young to recognize corruption. Poirot listened in silence. Valette came here often. He was charming, generous. He spoke of preserving history. And you trusted him. Poirot said gently, yes. The reliquary, the crow reliquary, had been hidden not by Valette, but by Father Michel himself. It was dangerous, the monk said. Men fought over it. Laval wanted recognition. Roche wanted money. Valette wanted power. And you? Poirot asked softly. I wanted silence. The reliquary had been concealed within the abbey's foundations. Sealed behind stone only monks could access. But Valette discovered the truth, Father Michel continued. He threatened exposure. Poirot nodded slowly. And Bernard? He was close. Too close. Moral justification. I did not kill for hatred, Father Michel insisted. I killed to protect Mont Saint-Michel. Poirot's eyes hardened. You killed to protect your choice, he corrected. And then you killed again to protect the lie. The monk's shoulders sagged. I could not allow the abbey to become a spectacle. The third truth. Poirot leaned forward. You did not push Valette. Father. Michel looked up sharply. No, Poirot continued. You confronted him. You told him the truth. And he chose the steps. Silence filled the room. And Bernard? Poirot pressed. I warned him, Father Michel whispered. He ran, and you followed. The monk closed his eyes. The witness, a sudden crack of thunder shook the windows. Poirot stood. There is one thing you do not know. Father, he said quietly. Father. Michel looked up. Someone else knows where the reliquary is hidden. The monk's composure shattered. Impossible. Poirot opened the door. Isabelle Moreau stepped. Inside. I found it, she said softly. In the old foundation chamber. Monsieur Valette left me instructions. Father Michel staggered back. The weight of stone. You see, Poirot said gently. Stone remembers. And secrets have weight. Father Michel sank into a chair. I thought I was preserving holiness, he whispered. Poirot's voice softened. You preserved only silence. And silence kills. The unfinished pattern. Leclerc entered moments later, summoned by Poirot. The monk did not resist as he was taken away. As dawn approached. The storm eased. Poirot stood once more at the window, watching the crows lift into the pale morning sky. One truth remains, he murmured. And one death yet unaccounted for. Hastings stared at him. Another? Poirot nodded gravely. Yes, the past always demands balance. Part 8. The third death morning came reluctantly to Mont Saint-Michel. The storm had passed, but it left behind a sky the color of old bruises and a silence that felt strained, unnatural like a held breath. The abbey bells did not ring at dawn. No prayers echoed through the stone corridors. Even the crows were absent. Hercule Poirot stood alone in the courtyard, his hands clasped behind his back, and felt something he rarely allowed himself to feel. Unease. Father Michel had confessed. The reliquary had been found. The pattern, neat and intellectual, appeared complete. And yet, no, Poirot murmured. Something resists. Captain Hastings joined him, rubbing his arms against the cold. Surely it's over now? Poirot did not answer, because endings he knew announced themselves. This one had not. The absence, it was Isabelle Moreau who noticed first. Where is Madame Valette? She asked quietly at breakfast. The question landed heavily. Marguerite Valette's chair sat empty, perfectly aligned with the table, her napkin folded with habitual precision. She was never late, never careless. Poirot's eyes sharpened. When did anyone last see her? He asked. Etienne Roche frowned. Last night, after Father Michel was taken away. Poirot felt the first chill of certainty. She did not sleep, he said softly. She waited. The locked room, Marguerite Valette's room, lay at the far end of the manor, overlooking the sea. Poirot approached it slowly, noting every detail of the carpet undisturbed. The door closed but not locked. Inside, the room was immaculate. Too immaculate. The bed untouched. The wardrobe open. One dress missing. Poirot crossed to the window. It was open. Below. The rocks descended sharply toward the tidal flats. Hastings swallowed. You don't think... Poirot raised a hand. Not yet. The discovery, they found her at low tide. Marguerite Valette lay at the base of the eastern wall, her body crumpled against the jagged stone. Her neck lay at an impossible angle, her elegant coat torn, her hair tangled with seaweed, but it was her face that troubled. Poirot most it was calm, peaceful, almost relieved. Inspector Leclerc arrived, grim and shaken. Suicide, he said heavily. She jumped. Poirot knelt beside the body, ignoring the damp sand. No, he said quietly. She was placed. The third pattern, Poirot examined the scene with ruthless precision. No footprints leading away. No signs of struggle. And yet, Marguerite Valette had not been desperate. She had been calculating. 3 deaths, Poirot murmured. 3 falls. Hastings stared at him. You think she was killed too? Poirot closed his eyes. I think, he said slowly, that I misunderstood her role. The letter Isabelle Moreau approached, pale and trembling, holding an envelope. This was on her desk, she said. Addressed to you. Poirot took it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper, written in Marguerite Valette's elegant hand. Monsieur Poirot, you see me as a survivor. You are mistaken. I was never protected. I was prepared. If you read this, then the stone has spoken at last. Poirot felt a rare tightening in his chest. She knew, Hastings whispered. Yes, Poirot replied. And she chose her ending. The hidden truth. Poirot returned to the scriptorium alone. He re-examined the documents. The map, the reliquary, and then he saw it. Marguerite Valette's name appeared, not as a witness. Not as a spouse, but as a beneficiary. She had financed Valette's acquisitions. She had known about the reliquary from the beginning. She was not a victim, Poirot murmured. She was a custodian. The real motive Marguerite Valette had not killed. She had orchestrated. She had married. Valette not for love, but for access. She had waited patiently, letting men destroy one another while she ensured the secret remained buried. Father Michel believed he protected the abbey. Marguerite Valette ensured it. And when exposure became inevitable, Poirot whispered, she removed herself. Not suicide. A final act of control. The uncomfortable conclusion. Poirot met the clerk privately. You will call it suicide, Poirot said. And officially, you will be correct. The clerk hesitated. And unofficially? Poirot looked toward the sea. Unofficially, he said. It is the last murder Mont Saint-Michel will commit. The weight of failure that night. Poirot stood alone beneath the abbey towers. I failed her, he said softly to Hastings. I saw guilt but not design. Hastings shook his head. You stopped further deaths. Poirot did not smile. I stopped noise, he replied. Not silence. Above them, the crows returned at last, circling once before settling into the stone. Poirot watched them gravely. 1 chapter remains, he murmured. And then truth. Part 9. The gathering of truth. The great dining hall of Mont Saint-Michel was cold and shadowed, though the fire in the hearth flared defiantly, casting flickering patterns on the ancient stone walls. The tide had withdrawn once again, leaving the island isolated and silent. As though waiting, Hercule Poirot stood at the head of the table, his posture immaculate, his hands clasped lightly in front of him. Captain Hastings was beside him, tense and silent, while Inspector Leclerc observed with an impatient scowl. One by one, the remaining guests entered. Their faces were pale, anxious, and wary. They knew, without being told, that this assembly was unusual, even by Mont Saint-Michel's extraordinary standards. Poirot's eyes swept across the room, noting every nuance of expression. The introduction, Mesdames et Messieurs, Poirot began. His voice measured, calm, and unnervingly precise. You are assembled here because truth has, at last, demanded it. The events of the past days, indeed, of decades, cannot remain concealed any longer. He paused, allowing the weight of his words to sink in. This is not accusation. It is clarity. The guests exchanged uneasy glances. Madame Fournier, though still dramatic, sat rigidly in her chair. Roche's jaw was clenched. Isabelle Moreau's hands fidgeted nervously. Father Michel, stoic as ever, did not move. Marguerite Valette was absent, but her presence was felt in the emptiness she left behind. Recounting the facts, Poirot began calmly, deliberately. First, the death of Monsieur Armand Valette. He fell or was guided to the courtyard steps. It was not accident. It was confrontation. He knew secrets that others wished hidden. The man who confronted him, the man who pushed him in the eyes of the world, believed he acted to protect Mont Saint-Michel. He looked directly at Father Michel. The monk did not flinch. Second, the death of Dr. Lucien Bernard. He pursued the truth of the reliquary. He trespassed into passages hidden by stone. He, too, was confronted. And again, the outcome was a fall that appeared accidental. The same individual controlled the environment, but allowed the victims' choices to seal their fates. Poirot's gaze swept across the room. Third, the death, or more accurately, the departure of Madame Marguerite Valette. She orchestrated events from within. She married not for love, but for control. She ensured the reliquary's secret remained, allowing others to believe they were the architects of death, while she removed herself from exposure. Exposing the red herrings, Poirot then addressed the assembled guests, systematically dismantling their fears and assumptions. Madame Fournier, he noted, was dramatic and emotionally invested, but her clues, including the crow-shaped clasp, were deliberately planted to mislead. She had motive in theory, but no means or opportunity to execute the deaths. Etienne Roche, driven by anger at Valette's betrayal of his family, had motive. But his movements and alibis confirmed he did not act. Isabelle Moreau, faithful and cautious, had access but no desire, no knowledge, and no precedent for intervention. Poirot's eyes lingered on the stone walls and floors. And finally, he said softly, the abbey itself was a witness. The passages, the tide, the stairs, they recorded movement, not murder. The true pattern. Poirot leaned forward slightly, voice calm yet precise. The killer, or more correctly, the orchestrator, was someone who understood human nature, who could manipulate the guilty into action, who used knowledge and anticipation rather than force. This individual did not need to strike. They allowed others' weaknesses to dictate outcomes. Their genius lay in invisibility. The room went still. Even the fire seemed to hesitate. Poirot continued. Father Michel believed he acted to protect history. He did so sincerely. Yet it was a miscalculation. He underestimated the foresight of others. And he was not alone in his orchestration. Marguerite Valette's role. Poirot turned to the empty chair. Madame Valette controlled what remained. Her absence is deliberate. She permitted Father Michel to act, observed outcomes, and intervened only when necessary to preserve the secret. He picked up the crow signet ring, holding it between two fingers. Symbolic, yes. But it also serves as a reminder that those who appear to fall first are not always the most culpable. Manipulation, patience, and knowledge, these, not strength, determine control. Hastings whispered, "So she's the master?" Poirot nodded. In effect, yes. Yet she used none of the violence others feared. Death followed, but by guidance, not hand. Asterisk. The confession's. Father Michel finally spoke. You are correct, he said quietly. I believed I protected Mont Saint-Michel. I confronted them. I allowed mistakes to seal their fate. And yet, he lowered his gaze. The outcomes were beyond me. Poirot nodded. You see, Father, human choice always interferes with the best laid plan. And here, the final choice was made by one wiser than you. Madame Fournier sighed, relief mingled with frustration. Roche slumped back, his anger dissipating into exhaustion. Isabelle Moreau wiped her palms on her skirt, processing each revelation. Poirot smiled faintly. Now, he said, the truth is complete. Closure. The tide crept in slowly outside, swallowing footprints, reclaiming sand and secrecy alike. The crows wheeled above, their cries no longer ominous but ceremonial observers to the resolution of events. Poirot surveyed the room one final time. All acts, all deaths, all secrets, they now lie exposed. Yet Mont Saint-Michel, eternal as stone, remains unchanged. History endures. Humanity, however, has been tested. Hastings exhaled, relief evident. "Do you feel it's over?" he asked. Poirot adjusted his mustache, gaze fixed on the ancient abbey. "Over?" he said softly. "No, Hastings. Over never truly comes. Only understanding, and in this case, the gathering of truth is complete. The rest belongs to time." The guests, though shaken, departed in quiet contemplation. The crows dispersed, and the abbey once again seemed merely a monument of stone. And Hercule Poirot, standing alone, allowed himself a rare smile. The mystery had been resolved, the pattern revealed, and the mind, ever vigilant, had triumphed over both deception and human folly. Asterisk Part 10. Death explains the crows. The POIROT'S, do you? Evening settled on Mont Saint-Michel like a velvet curtain. The tide had begun to rise once again, drawing a silver line around the base of the island, separating it from the world as completely as it had at the storm's onset. Inside the manor, the guests gathered one final time in the great dining hall. Their faces were pale, but calm now, tinged with the cautious relief of those who have glimpsed the truth. Hercule Poirot stood at the head of the table, as immaculate and composed as ever. The crows outside had returned in small numbers, perching silently on battlements and gargoyles. Their black eyes glittered like sentinels of history. Poirot's gaze swept across the room. "Madame et messieurs," he began, voice low and deliberate. "The events of the past days have tested every human instinct, fear, ambition, love, and greed. Yet, above all, they have tested prudence and observation." The crow's secret Poirot pointed toward the window where the birds had gathered. "The crows," he said softly, "are more than omens. They are witnesses. Just as stone remembers, so does nature. When Monsieur Villette walked the island in life, the crows observed his movements and symbolically his sins. When death approached, they gathered because the pattern of guilt, vengeance, and secrecy demanded recognition." He paused. The guests leaned forward, enraptured. Each death was a lesson, each fall a signal. The first Monsieur Villette fell by his own choice, yet under the subtle influence of one who sought to protect knowledge, Father Michel. The second Dr. Bernard fell because he pursued truth too aggressively, unaware of the unseen pathways of Mont Saint-Michel. And the third, Madame Villette. She chose to remove herself from the stage entirely, preserving the secret and ensuring the abbey's safety above all. Hastings muttered, "So in the end, no one actually killed her?" Poirot smiled faintly. "Exactement. Not all deaths are acts of violence. Some are exercises in control, strategy, and human foresight. Yet they leave the same impression, inevitability." The moral reckoning Poirot's eyes swept over the remaining guests. "You see, everyone here contributed, knowingly or unknowingly, to the unfolding of these events. Human nature, with its flaws, its desires, and its misjudgments, interacts with the past in ways that are sometimes cruel, sometimes inevitable." Etienne Roche, still tense, spoke sharply. "So we were all manipulated?" "Not manipulated, mon ami," Poirot corrected gently. "Guided by circumstances, by knowledge, by history itself, and by the choices of those who understood both human nature and the abbey's secrets." Father Michel's role, Poirot turned to Father Michel, whose face was a mask of serenity tinged with resignation. "You acted to protect Mont Saint-Michel," Poirot said softly. "You acted in good faith, but your good intentions allowed tragedy to occur. You underestimated Madame Villette's foresight, underestimated the cunning of time and circumstance. And yet," Father Michel's voice was low, "and yet what, Monsieur Poirot?" "Your actions were part of a larger design," Poirot said. "A design that is now complete. The abbey remains safe, the reliquary hidden, and the crows silent witnesses." The final lesson Poirot turned back to the assembled guests. Human folly is always evident when ambition, secrecy, and desire for power intersect. Mont Saint-Michel is a microcosm of this truth. The crows gather not to herald death for the sake of fear, but to mark the end of imbalance. They observe, as do I, and remind us that history and morality are inexorably linked. He allowed the room to absorb the weight of his words. Silence stretched like a taut string. Poirot picked up the small crow-shaped signet ring. Symbolic, he said, of vigilance, foresight, and inevitability. It has been the emblem, the clue, and the witness. And now it shall rest once again with the stones it watches over. Closure, the guests departed slowly, the sound of boots against stone echoing like a soft drum of reconciliation. The tide rose, swallowing footprints, washing away evidence, and reclaiming the flats for the sea. Poirot remained at the window, watching the last crows wheel into the distance, their black forms silhouetted against the crimson sunset. "Hastings," he said quietly, "we have observed. We have understood. And yet, even when truth prevails, the human heart will always remember fear, guilt, and ambition." Hastings nodded. "So it's finally over." Poirot allowed himself the faintest of smiles. "Over, yes. But Mont Saint-Michel endures. And the crows. They endure too, as eternal witnesses of what men can do when history and human nature converge." As darkness fell and the abbey towers gleamed against the twilight, Hercule Poirot knew that the lessons of this mystery would linger long after the last tide had retreated, and that even in the silence, Mont Saint-Michel had spoken. Asterisk.